Picture this. A number so large, it has 12 zeros. That's a trillion. Now imagine $37.6 trillion. That's the current debt of the United States government. Not billions, trillions. The kind of number that makes your brain shut down trying to comprehend it. But here's where it gets really strange. Japan, the world's third largest economy, owes even more relative to its size. Over 250% of everything the country produces in an entire year. Singapore? 175%. And here's the part that should make you pause. These aren't failing economies. These are some of the most sophisticated financial systems on the planet. Countries that the entire world relies on. Yet somehow, they're all drowning in debt. Europe collectively owes over $18 trillion. China, despite being everyone's creditor in popular imagination, is buried under more than $26 trillion in total debt. If these astronomical debts were truly unsustainable, if they were the disaster they appear to be, these economies should have collapsed long ago. But they haven't. In fact, the debt keeps growing, and the system keeps running. So here's the mystery that should keep you up at night. If everyone owes money, who exactly are they paying? And if no one can actually pay it back, why does the whole system still work? Hold on. Before we dive into this research, I need to know something. Where are you joining from, and what time is it there right now? Country, city, local time. Put it all in the comments below. I really want to see how global this is. Let's start with something that might surprise you. Debt isn't some modern financial instrument that we invented in the age of credit cards and mortgages. The first recorded evidence of debt as something completely normal dates back to 3000 BCE in ancient Mesopotamia, what we now call Iraq. Archaeologists discovered clay tablets written in cuneiform script containing detailed records of loans, most often in the form of grain or silver. And here's the kicker. Even back then, you had to pay interest on debt. The standard interest rate for grain loans could reach 33%, while silver loans typically ran around 20% annually. Think about that. For thousands of years, people were paying interest on borrowed goods, whether it was grain, livestock, or precious metals. But over time, these simple loans transformed into something far more powerful, a force capable of building cities and destroying empires. As kings and queens led increasingly lavish lifestyles and waged ever more expensive wars, their treasuries constantly ran dry. In the mid-18th century, this exact problem confronted Catherine II of Russia. The empire was locked in an exhausting war with Turkey, and the treasury was emptying at an alarming rate. Borrowing from nobles was unreliable, and raising taxes was dangerous. So the empress made a bold financial move. In 1769, she established the Assignation Bank and issued Russia's first paper money, called assignations. Following this, Russia, for the first time in its history, began actively borrowing money abroad and issuing domestic loans with repayment in these printed assignations. All of this allowed the empress to spend more than she had in gold and silver. And she wasn't alone in this approach. Her main rivals in Europe, the kings of England and France, had long been building their empires on a foundation of government bonds and banknotes, turning the ability to borrow and print into the most important instrument of power. This changed everything. The state gained an almost inexhaustible source of funds without directly emptying the pockets of its subjects. Government debt grew like a snowball. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Empire was one of the world's largest debtors, financing both wars and the grand construction of railways through loans. By the 20th century, bonds had become a global phenomenon. The First and Second World Wars forced countries to borrow on an unprecedented scale, first to wage war, then to rebuild. World War II so severely depleted most major European countries that by 1944, the US dollar became the central element of the new global financial system. This formed the Bretton Woods system, also known as the gold dollar standard. Its essence was the pegging of national currencies of most countries to the US dollar at a fixed rate. And the dollar itself, in turn, had direct gold backing. But this golden foundation quickly cracked. The gold reserve in the United States was not infinite and soon began to melt before everyone's eyes. Other countries built their economies on flows of their own paper money, exchanged them for dollars, and then received real, non-paper gold. The U.S. also printed dollars to finance the Vietnam War and other expenses. A loud signal came in 1965 when France's President Charles de Gaulle, concerned about American monetary policy, began a massive operation to export gold in exchange for accumulated paper dollars, sending ships and planes to physically remove many tons of metal from U.S. vaults. This is precisely why, in 1971, President Nixon, abandoning the dollar's peg to gold, collapsed the remnants of the Bretton Woods world, opening a new era in financial history. The era of fiat currencies, currencies backed only by government decree. Now governments could create money at will. And if this sounds like a recipe for endless borrowing, that's exactly what it was. If at the beginning of the 70s the ratio of combined private and public global debt was only around 100% of global GDP, by the end of the 80s this figure had doubled. Governments quickly realized that borrowing was useful not only in wartime, they could also stimulate economic growth. According to estimates from the World Bank and the Institute of International Finance, today the total debt on our planet has reached an astronomical $320 trillion and continues to grow relentlessly. That's 3 times larger than the size of the entire global economy. But who is the ultimate creditor? Who does everyone owe? Perhaps the truth is that the world's main creditor is China? Exact lending volumes remain a subject of debate. However, there's no doubt that China owns bonds from the planet's largest countries, primarily the US, worth trillions of dollars. However, the claim that China is America's largest creditor would be inaccurate, because the first foreign holder of US government debt is actually Japan. It may seem strange that Japan, as America's largest creditor, is simultaneously the world's largest debtor. But if you look closely, this is more the general rule than the exception. Like Japan, China is only superficially the planet's main creditor. Under the hood of its economy, like all other countries, we see a tangled world of mutual debts. For example, many European banks actively invest in the Chinese domestic bond market through the Bond Connect program. China, in turn, is a major buyer of American and Euro bonds. American banks readily provide loans to Europe, and Europe willingly holds American debt instruments. This creates an endless loop where money constantly flows in all directions between all players. Every major economy is simultaneously both creditor and debtor. It's like a massive game of financial musical chairs where everyone owes everyone else, and the music never stops. Let me give you some perspective on how large $320 trillion really is. Imagine a ribbon of $100 bills that could wrap around our planet 11,000 times, connect it to the sun 3 times over, and even cover the journey to Mars and back. So if every country is borrowing, from whom? And if everyone owes money, to whom? As soon as we start talking about global government debt, imagination immediately paints a familiar picture. A secret world government pulling all the levers, controlling the flows, and owning all the money. But in reality, modern debt more closely resembles the movement of oil or gas through a complex pipeline system, with movement occurring in all directions simultaneously. To better understand this concept, Let's look at any large country, for example, the European Union, United States, or Japan. Who can actually lend them so much money? The answer is surprisingly simple. It's mainly the citizens themselves, Europeans, Americans, and Japanese. They own about 70% of their own country's debt. And here's how it works. Governments borrow money by issuing bonds and promising to return them with interest. When you put money in a bank, it doesn't just sit in accounts. To pay you interest, banks, trying to multiply it, issue loans, and buy commercial and government bonds. Commercial banks in the US, Europe, and Japan hold government bonds of their governments worth many trillions of dollars. Government bonds are the most popular investment because they're a safe way to earn interest on free money. Considering that central banks of all countries try to support government debt through monetary emission, government bonds can be discussed as a risk-free asset. And this is one of the main reasons why bonds and debt are so popular. Of course, it's not only banks buying bonds. Anyone with a large cash reserve buys them. Pension funds, insurance companies, investment firms. They all do the same thing. Buy bonds and receive interest. No matter which country you live in, your future pension is most likely already invested in government debt. If you've insured your car, the money received for insurance has been partially or fully invested by your insurance company in government bonds. Last year, American pension funds lent to the government budget a quarter of all their money. In Europe, figures vary from 25 to 50% depending on the country. For insurance companies, this figure is even higher, more than 60%. And they all use bonds as a way to multiply funds at low risk. This creates a kind of network where people's savings become borrowed money for governments. So, although it may sound surprising, large countries borrow mainly from themselves. When a government pays interest on its debt, this money returns to the hands of creditors, giving them even more free funds. And what do they do with them? They buy more bonds and earn more interest. The debt system turns into an endless cycle where money constantly circulates through the same system, moving from creditor to borrower, then back to creditor, and again to borrower, over and over again. The same cycle exists not only domestically, but also between countries. About 25% of Eurozone debt belongs to foreigners because, just like European banks or pension funds, foreign governments and banks also invest their free money in European bonds. This happens everywhere. Every country borrows, and every country lends. Japanese savings become loans for Chileans. Chilean savings become loans for Chinese. And Chinese savings ultimately return to American bonds. Global debt is more like an interconnected web, where money flows in circles from savers to borrowers and back, both within and between countries. Governments borrow, investors lend, and interest payments maintain this cycle. And although part of this money crosses borders, most of it never leaves the system. So if governments continue to borrow and spend, how will they repay their debts in the future? The answer is simple. They just take on new debts to pay off old ones. As threatening as this sounds, it's a fundamental principle, the foundation on which the global economy now operates. But why doesn't the world just stop borrowing? Because we've reached a point where everything is built on debt. When governments borrow and spend, money circulates in the economy. Businesses earn more, workers receive salaries, and spending it generates profit for business. Loans support economic growth. What would happen if, frightened, governments suddenly stopped borrowing? Money wouldn't flow into the economy. Businesses would start laying off employees, demand for goods and services would fall, and a feedback loop would plunge the global economy into a vortex of chaos and recession. The financial crisis of 2008 became an ideal illustration of the domino principle for many countries. Panic in the government debt market and falling demand led to countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Italy unable to find buyers, left without money. Unemployment skyrocketed. GDP contracted by 10 to 25%, and wages in the hardest-hit Greece fell by 25%. However, the vaccine against debt fever didn't work for too long, and in 2020, facing an economic crisis due to the pandemic, governments of all countries returned to their old ways, and it's quite obvious they couldn't have acted otherwise. People stopped spending, the economy went into a tailspin, and states were forced to print and borrow. In just 2020 alone, global debt grew by $14 trillion. Everyone borrowed and printed: China, Europe, the United States. In reality, they had no choice. In the midst of the crisis, any delay threatened to collapse the entire economy. But if you borrowed money, you need to return it in the future. Where do you get money to repay old debts? The answer is simple: borrow more. And this raises an obvious but uncomfortable question. Can this continue forever? However smooth this cycle may seem, everyone suspects we have huge problems. Although risks are continuously rising, no one is ready to stop. And most likely, it's already impossible. For any politician, this would be career suicide. As governments continue to borrow, debt grows, and with it, interest payments. Over time, an increasingly large part of the budget goes to paying off old loans rather than financing new schools, hospitals, or infrastructure. A government debt-to-GDP ratio of 100% was once considered a sign of catastrophe. And Japan's example, which lived for many decades with even worse debt, was a unique exception to the rule. Now it's almost the norm. For many decades, this wasn't a serious problem for Japan because those willing to lend money to the government at low interest were always found. But in recent years, everything has begun to change rapidly. The growth in borrowing costs for a country with a government debt-to-GDP ratio of almost 300% has acquired threatening momentum and is breaking records from the past millennium. When investors stop lending, borrowing money becomes many times more expensive. This is usually an avalanche-like and catastrophic process. The main way governments try to cope with this is by printing even more money, a wonderful solution that has confirmed its effectiveness since the gold standard, which, however, has one significant drawback. When too much money enters the system, uncontrollable inflation begins. The lessons of the past are well known and well described by economists. All countries that abused this easy solution sooner or later received a bill that is always paid in the same currency: the well-being of their own citizens. Let me give you the latest numbers so you understand just how serious this has become. As of October 2025, the United States federal government debt stands at $37.6 trillion. That's an increase of over $2 trillion in just one fiscal year. To put this in perspective, the U.S. government is now spending more on interest payments than on national defense. In fiscal year 2025, interest payments reached $970 billion, making it the third largest federal expenditure behind only Social Security and Medicare. Think about that. Nearly $1 trillion every single year just to service existing debt, not to build anything new, not to invest in the future, just to pay interest on money already borrowed. The global picture is even more staggering. According to the International Monetary Fund, global public debt surpassed $100 trillion in 2024 and continues to climb. The Institute of International Finance reports that when you add private debt into the mix, corporations, households, financial institutions, the total global debt reaches $320 trillion. That's 335% of global GDP. In other words, The world owes more than 3 times what it produces annually. And here's what should really alarm you. 61 developing countries now spend 10% or more of their government revenues just on interest payments. That means 3.4 billion people live in countries that spend more on servicing debt than on either health or education. In the United States, the debt grows by approximately $5.7 billion every single day. That's $238 million per hour, or nearly $4 million per minute. By the time you finish watching this video, the U.S. debt will have grown by tens of millions of dollars. And it's not slowing down. The Congressional Budget Office projects that under current policies, the debt-to-GDP ratio will reach 156% by 2055. Some economists warn it could hit 220% if tax cuts are extended and new spending isn't controlled. Japan's situation is even more precarious. With government debt at 250% of GDP, Japan has been living on borrowed time for decades. For years, this worked because Japanese citizens and institutions were willing to buy government bonds at extremely low interest rates, essentially lending their own savings to their government at minimal cost. But interest rates are rising globally, and Japan is feeling the squeeze. The cost of servicing this massive debt is beginning to consume an ever larger share of the national budget, leaving less for everything else. The UK recently faced what some analysts called a potential debt-death spiral, where rising interest rates and insufficient tax revenue created a dangerous feedback loop. France, Germany, Italy, all facing similar pressures. China presents perhaps the most interesting case. While China holds significant amounts of foreign debt, primarily U.S. Treasury bonds, its domestic debt situation is alarming. Total Chinese debt, including government, corporate, and household debt, exceeds 300% of GDP. And here's the hidden danger. Much of China's corporate debt is actually implicit government debt. Borrowing by state-owned enterprises and local government financing vehicles that aren't officially counted in national statistics. The real number could be much higher. Some estimates suggest China's total debt could be closer to 350% of GDP when you include these hidden obligations. So let's address the elephant in the room. If everyone is borrowing and everyone is lending, if the whole system is this interconnected web of circular debt, what happens when the music stops? What happens when creditors decide they don't want to lend anymore? History gives us some disturbing answers. When confidence collapses, interest rates spike, making new borrowing prohibitively expensive. Governments face a choice: default on their obligations, restructure their debt, or print massive amounts of money to inflate away the real value of what they owe. All three options have severe consequences. Default means a government simply says we cannot pay what we owe. This destroys a country's credit rating, locks it out of international bond markets, and typically leads to economic collapse. Argentina has defaulted 9 times in its history. Each time, the consequences were devastating. Currency collapse, hyperinflation, massive unemployment, social unrest. Greece came close to default during the Eurozone crisis, and even the partial restructuring that occurred caused enormous pain. The economy shrank by 25%, unemployment hit nearly 30%, and an entire generation saw their prospects destroyed. Restructuring is a softer version of default, where a government says we'll pay you back, but not as much as we promised, or not as soon. This still damages credibility and raises future borrowing costs, but it's less catastrophic than outright default. However, it requires cooperation from creditors, which isn't always forthcoming, especially when debt is held by thousands of different bondholders around the world. The third option, printing money, is the most politically palatable in the short term because it doesn't require admitting failure. The government simply creates new money to pay its obligations. But the consequences are equally severe. Inflation. When too much money chases too few goods, prices rise. In extreme cases, you get hyperinflation. Weimar Germany in the 1920s, Zimbabwe in the 2000s, Venezuela in the 2010s. In each case, life savings were wiped out, the economy collapsed, and social order broke down. The German hyperinflation helped pave the way for the rise of extremism. These aren't abstract economic concepts. They're human tragedies that destroyed millions of lives. Now here's what makes our current situation unprecedented. Never before in human history have we seen global debt at this level, with interest rates rising after more than a decade of near-zero rates. From 2008 to 2021, central banks around the world kept interest rates at historically low levels and engaged in massive quantitative easing, essentially creating trillions of dollars of new money to buy government bonds. This allowed governments to borrow at incredibly cheap rates. In some cases, rates were actually negative, meaning creditors paid governments for the privilege of lending to them. That era is over. Since 2022, central banks have been raising interest rates to combat inflation, and although rates have started to decline again in late 2024 and 2025, they remain well above the near-zero levels that prevailed for over a decade. This means every government in the world is now facing higher costs to service existing debt and to issue new debt. For countries with debt-to-GDP ratios above 100%, this is extremely dangerous. A small increase in interest rates can translate to hundreds of billions of dollars in additional annual interest costs. Let me paint you a picture of what this could mean. Imagine you're running a household that spends $100,000 a year, but only earns $90,000. You've been making up the difference with credit cards and loans. At first, interest rates were 2%, so your $10,000 annual deficit only cost you a few $100s in interest. Painful, but manageable. Then interest rates rise to 7%. Suddenly, you're not just paying interest on this year's $10,000 deficit. You're paying 7% interest on all the debt you've accumulated over the years. If you owe $300,000, that's $21,000 a year just in interest. Now your deficit is much worse because you still have the $10,000 gap between income and spending, plus $21,000 in interest payments. So you need to borrow $31,000 this year, which means next year's interest costs will be even higher. This is the debt spiral, and it's exactly what governments are facing. The United States is in a relatively privileged position because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. People and institutions around the world want to hold dollars and dollar-denominated assets, which means there's strong demand for U.S. Treasury bonds, even at relatively low interest rates. But this privilege isn't unlimited. If the U.S. debt situation continues to deteriorate, if markets begin to doubt America's willingness or ability to service its debt, demand for treasuries could dry up, forcing interest rates much higher. Some economists warn of a potential treasury market crisis, where a sudden loss of confidence triggers a mass sell-off, spiking rates and making the debt unsustainable almost overnight. For countries without reserve currencies, the situation is even more precarious. Developing nations often borrow in dollars or euros rather than their own currencies because international investors don't trust local currency bonds. This creates a double bind. If their own currency weakens against the dollar, the real value of their debt increases even if they haven't borrowed any more money. And when global interest rates rise, they get hit with higher borrowing costs they can't control. This is why debt crises in developing countries tend to be so severe and so sudden. One day everything seems fine, The next day, the country can't roll over its debt and faces default. So what's the end game here? Are we heading for an inevitable global debt crisis? The honest answer is, nobody knows. What we do know is that the current path is unsustainable. You cannot indefinitely grow debt faster than the economy grows. Eventually, the mathematics catches up with you. But predicting when and how this happens is nearly impossible. Japan has defied predictions of collapse for 30 years. The US has been running large deficits for decades. The Eurozone survived a near-death experience in 2012 and limped along. Systems can persist in unsustainable states for a surprisingly long time, especially when all the major players have a vested interest in keeping the game going. But history suggests that when debt crises do arrive, they tend to come suddenly and catch everyone by surprise. The 2008 financial crisis wasn't triggered by government debt. It was private debt, mortgages, and corporate borrowing that collapsed first. But it quickly became a government debt crisis as countries borrowed trillions to bail out banks and stimulate their economies. The next crisis could follow a similar pattern, or it could be completely different. Perhaps rising geopolitical tensions lead to a war that requires massive emergency borrowing. Perhaps a new pandemic emerges that's even more economically destructive than COVID-19. Perhaps climate change starts imposing costs that dwarf current spending. Or perhaps it's something we haven't even considered yet. What we can say with confidence is this: the current system is built on several key assumptions. First, that economic growth will continue, allowing countries to grow their way out of debt. Second, that inflation will remain relatively controlled, preventing the need for very high interest rates. Third, that there will always be willing buyers for government bonds. And fourth, that major economies won't default or restructure their debt. If any of these assumptions prove false, the consequences could be severe. So here are 3 clear conclusions from this deep dive into global debt. First, understand that when we talk about government debt, we're really talking about a complex web where citizens of countries effectively lend to their own governments through banks, pension funds, and insurance companies. This means that a debt crisis isn't just an abstract problem for governments to solve. It directly threatens your pension, your savings, your insurance policies. When Greece restructured its debt, Greek pension funds, holding large amounts of Greek government bonds, saw their assets evaporate, leading to massive cuts in pension payments. The same could happen anywhere. Second, realize that the current system is unprecedented in human history. Never before have we had purely fiat currencies backed by nothing but government promises, global debt at 3 times global GDP, and interest rates rising after more than a decade near zero. We are in uncharted territory. Anyone who tells you they know exactly what will happen is either lying or delusional. But the fact that we don't know exactly what will happen doesn't mean we can't prepare or that we shouldn't be concerned. The risks are real and growing. Third, recognize that this is ultimately a political problem, not just an economic one. Governments could reduce debt by raising taxes, cutting spending, or some combination of both. But these are politically toxic decisions. No politician wants to be the one who raises taxes or cuts popular programs. It's always easier to borrow more and leave the problem for the next administration. Until the political incentives change, until voters demand fiscal responsibility, even if it means short-term pain, the borrowing will continue. Here's my warning, and this is perhaps the most important part of this entire investigation. There is no realistic scenario where this ends well if we continue on the current path. The best-case scenario is that governments gradually get their fiscal houses in order, slowly reducing debt-to-GDP ratios over decades through a combination of modest spending cuts, reasonable tax increases, and steady economic growth. This is the soft landing. It requires political courage and public support for difficult decisions. It's possible, but based on current trends, it seems unlikely. The more probable scenarios range from painful to catastrophic. We could see a gradual erosion of living standards as more and more government revenue goes to interest payments rather than services and investment. We could see recurring debt crises in smaller countries that spread contagion to larger economies. We could see a major economy face a crisis that forces restructuring or default, shaking confidence in the entire system. Or we could see central banks forced to choose between allowing debt crises or printing massive amounts of money, leading to high inflation that erodes savings and purchasing power. None of these scenarios are pleasant. All of them involve real pain for real people. The question is not whether there will be consequences for this level of debt, but when those consequences arrive and how severe they will be. What's most frustrating is that solutions exist. They're not easy and they're not painless, but they exist. Countries could reform tax systems to close loopholes and ensure everyone pays their fair share. They could reform entitlement programs to reflect demographic realities. They could invest in productivity-enhancing infrastructure and education. They could prioritize long-term fiscal sustainability over short-term political gains. But these require political will that seems to be in short supply. For individuals, the implications are clear. Understand that your financial security is tied to the stability of government finances more than you might think. Diversify your investments across countries and asset classes. Be skeptical of promises that depend on the government's ability to borrow indefinitely at low rates. Prepare for a future where taxes may be higher, government services may be reduced, and economic growth may be slower. Most importantly, educate yourself about these issues and hold your political representatives accountable. The decisions made over the next few years will shape the economic landscape for decades to come. The global debt situation is like a slow-motion train wreck. We can see it happening. We know it's going to end badly, but the political and economic momentum keeps us moving forward on the same track. Understanding this doesn't mean you should panic or withdraw from society, but it does mean you should be informed, prepared, and engaged. Because when $320 trillion of debt comes due, and when the world realizes that it can't all be repaid, the consequences will touch every aspect of our lives. This is not about fear-mongering. It's about understanding reality. The global financial system has evolved into something unprecedented, a massive interconnected web of obligations that binds every country and every person on the planet. We're all creditors and debtors simultaneously, all dependent on the continuation of a system built on promises that may not be kept. There's no simple way out, no painless solution, no magic fix. But understanding the problem is the first step toward dealing with it. And right now, far too few people truly understand just how deep in debt the world has become, and what that means for our collective future. Thanks for watching till the end. If you're here, you're one of those who want to understand how the financial system really works. Subscribe, new research tomorrow. And drop a comment. What do you think about this? Your perspective matters.